Hello, my name is Carlo Mehegan and I am a rising senior at William & Mary. I am an Ag Aid intern and I am working with the University of Virginia's Biocomplexity Institute on my project. Our work is comprised of creating visualizations based on output from complex simulation models, as well as automating that process. To begin, I would like to talk about the work that led to my project. My work builds off of previous work that the Biocomplexity Institute did, which is encapsulated in this paper. I wanted to use this as a starting point, and in this presentation, we will cover three main topics. Number one is complex simulation models, and specifically Vic-Crop-Cyst. So first we need to talk about what is Vic-Crop-Cyst, what kind of data does it simulate, and what issues do researchers have when using this tool. Second, we get more into the realm of the paper listed here. How can we solve the issues Vic-Crop-Cyst has using machine learning techniques? Finally, we get into my work, which builds off of the machine learning research, specifically making visualizations and streamlining that process. So to begin, we need to talk about Vic-Crop-Cyst. This is actually a combination of two agricultural models. Crop-Cyst simulates plant processes and crop growth, and Vic, which is short for variable infiltration capacity, simulates the water cycle and hydrology factors. These two models were put together in order to simulate relationships between these different areas of agriculture. And this is where the issue of explainability starts to come in. Both of these models on their own have dozens, if not hundreds of variables that are being kept track of, both inputs and outputs. Combining them and taking the combinations between all of the variables between the two turns this into an exponentially more complex simulation. So, for example, if we want to know how much grain would grow in a specific area with a specific set of parameters, Vic-Crop-Cyst can simulate that, but it becomes difficult if we want to work backwards. So if we want to know which variables contributed to grain growth the most, it becomes difficult to unravel. We could run the model multiple times, changing the parameters to see how the output changes, but at the scale of a complex model like this, the output data can be hundreds of gigabytes for a single simulation, so it quickly becomes unfeasible. Basically, the model can become a sort of black box. We see the inputs and we see the outputs, but what's happening in between can be difficult to figure out because of the complexity and the scale. So now we can talk a little bit more about the paper from before, which attempts to solve these explainability issues using a pipeline of machine learning techniques. In this pipeline, they take the inputs and outputs from Vic-Crop-Cyst and use clustering and classification to create a surrogate model. We don't need to go into detail too much about clustering and classification, but the important thing about this surrogate model is that it has more explainability. When a classification model wants to figure out what cluster a data point would go into, it weighs the input parameters to determine how different or important each one is. This weighing of parameters allows us to see how important each parameter is to the model, which gives us more explainability. The paper goes on from here to test this machine learning pipeline, and I won't get too much farther into the details, but this is an example of the work being done with Vic-Crop-Cyst and with complex models, and this was the starting point for my project. So now we get to the visualizations. One of the issues that came up with the project in the last slide was the effort required to visualize simulation results. My project was to explore this side of the work. There are two maps shown here. The first one is from the paper and represents the different clusters in the paper's experiment. The second map is from my own work, and we'll get to that in a little bit. There were a few goals going into the project. We wanted the graphs to be interactive, meaning you could hover over them to see more information, or tweak which information you were looking at. We also wanted these graphs to be easily embeddable into a web page, and we wanted to be able to automate some of the steps involved in parsing the data and sharing the graphs online. The end product would be a sort of online dashboard where visualizations can be viewed and new ones can easily be added. So going into this work, the first part of the process was wrangling the data I needed and getting it into the format that I wanted. What made this tricky is the sheer scale of the data that we're working with. Normally, I would be able to download the data and work with it locally, but some of these simulations were over 100 gigabytes, which means downloading them wasn't very feasible. Once I was able to access this data through UVA's lab machines, I used Python scripts to extract data and make smaller CSV files of just the necessary outputs. These parsing scripts were also built off of the work in the paper mentioned earlier, where they used the same Vic-Crop-Cyst output, but extracted different data. The result of this processing was a bunch of CSV files, each less than a few megabytes, which was much smaller than the original dataset. The next step was taking this data and graphing it. I made a few visualizations for this project, the main one being a map that shows the yield for different types of crops in Washington based on different parameters, and we'll see that in a second. I used Plotly for my graphs because they come with a lot of functionality baked in, like being able to zoom and hover over different elements, and being able to convert graphs straight to HTML. So the next step was to take the graphs that we made and put them on a web page. This first graph shows crop yield in Washington and the surrounding areas, and we can switch this between grain, vegetation, fruit, and hay. We can also scroll through the years to see how this has changed. We can also hover over different dots to see their latitude and longitude and the value of crop yield in each of these areas. This second visualization shows the yield over time for each crop type. We can hover over different points to see what year it is, the total yield, and which crop it is. This webpage also has an About section for more information and a documentation section which explains how the website works, how to make new Plotly graphs, and how to add these to the website, which we will get to in a moment. So that was a quick tour of the webpage. Now we can talk about how we simplified the process of adding new content to that page. There are a couple of steps involved if you wanted to update this web page with a new graph. First, you would need to bring in your Plotly script, then generate that graph, embed it into the HTML, update the file permissions so that the web page can access the new files, and update the shell script that keeps all of the graphs updated. To minimize those steps, we created a Python script that does all of this for the user. So if someone wants to contribute, they just need to add their Plotly script to the project, then run this update viz workflow script. This script will update the web page to include all of the graphs, and update the shell script to generate all of the files, as well as taking care of permissions and file creation. Minimizing these steps helps keep this project accessible to future contributors and keeps this project extensible. So this brings us up to present day, and there are a few goals for if this project continues in the future. One of these goals is to add new visualizations and continue to grow the project. Another goal would be to have interactivity between different graphs. For example, if you select fruit as a type of crop to analyze, all of the relevant graphs would update to show only fruit. The goal of this project was to make something extensible, and that leaves a lot of room for future growth. I hope that this project can continue in the future and be used for future analyses.